Good morning. I'm Yevana Knežević. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, one of 14 area study centers and programs that comprise Stanford Global Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues at Stanford Global Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the 7th annual symposium. It's been wonderful over the years to see the growth in this symposium, both in terms of the number of participants, the number of attendees, and also that we've grown geographically. And this year, for the first time, welcome attendees from beyond the state of California. The growth in the symposium to us is a sign of the recognition of educators at the secondary, community college, and four-year institution level of the importance of broadening the perspectives of their students geographically and temporally, of challenging and diversifying existing narratives we have about the world, and of understanding that we need to help all of our students make sense of the interconnected world in which they live and in which they will work. This symposium is primarily a culminating event of the EPIC Fellows Program. And today, this morning, you will see presentations of the 10 EPIC Fellows who have worked in partnership with Stanford over the course of this past year on individual projects that have internationalized both the academic and co-curricular programming at their home institutions. This is the first year that we have had the current model of this Fellows Program, which brings all of the fellows together to campus for a 3-day intensive series of workshops in the summer, but then connects them in monthly meetings over Zoom over the course of the year before bringing everybody back together again for this weekend. And leveraging technology, I think in these most positive of ways, has allowed us also to broaden the geographical reach of this program, not just beyond the immediate location here surrounding Stanford, but again, beyond the state of California. And 2 of our fellows this year come from the state of Texas. This expansion of the program is also reflected in the burgeoning Global Studies Educators Network. And this afternoon, there will be 2 sessions, which are inaugural sessions of the network. And the network is comprised of former EPIC fellows, who have remained engaged in promoting global studies at their institutions, but also engaged in this partnership that we've built together. And the idea behind the Global Studies Network is that we will support each other in internationalizing curriculum and promoting global studies programs at campuses, and thus grow it both beyond the Fellows Program to include colleagues, a much larger number of colleagues who are dedicated to promoting global studies and international education. And just as a final note, I want to say that really what underlies the program and the success of the program is the P in EPIC, which is partnership. And so we are very happy to see you all here today. We're looking forward to a fascinating and fruitful day, and welcome. And now I would like to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Kate Coons, who is the Executive Director of Stanford Global Studies and who will introduce our keynote speaker for today.
Thank you, Yovana. Welcome, everyone. Very happy to see you here. New faces, old faces. It is my distinct pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Richard Saller as our keynote speaker. Professor Saller is the Kleinheinz Family Professor of European Studies here at Stanford University. He's now teaching in the Classics Department, but as of last fall, He was the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences here at Stanford, which meant he was the cognizant dean for Stanford Global Studies. We consider him one of our great boosters and allies. Prior to joining Stanford, he was provost and dean of the Social Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. Professor Saller's research focuses on Roman social and economic history, in particular patronage relationships, the family, and the imperial economy. He uses literary, legal, and epigraphic materials, as well as computer simulations, to investigate issues of social hierarchy, gender distinctions, and economic production. His most recent publication is The Roman Empire, Economy, Society, and Culture, which has been translated into French, Italian, German, Greek, and Spanish. He was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2005, and we are most happy to have him here today because during his tenure as dean, Professor Saller was very instrumental in supporting the work of Stanford Global Studies, and he was particularly helpful in helping us further develop our scholarship in Islamic studies and South Asian studies. His talk today is entitled Beyond Eurocentrism at Stanford, and so please help me welcome Professor Richard Saller.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about what I think is one of the most important issues in higher education today, and that is making sure that the next generation knows something about the world beyond our borders. And I say that having come of age in the Vietnam era, when, of course, the United States participated in a tragedy that killed millions of people. In part, that grew out of a lack of understanding of Southeast Asia. And I think it's critical that we not repeat that kind of tragedy if we can help it. Let me start with a little bit of background to explain the title, Beyond Eurocentrism at Stanford. Stanford was founded in 1891, and for the first 50 years or so of its existence, it was a respectable regional university. And then after World War II, Fred Terman, one of the greatest academic administrators of the 20th century, pulled Stanford up by its ears to be a competitor in the world. He did this in part through pursuing big science and government grants, but then on the side of humanities and social sciences, he decided to build steeples of excellence. And those steeples were concentrated on Europe. And that for the very good reason that at the time, you could get most mileage out of commitment of resources by building in European studies, because that's where reputation was primarily based. That's in part because, of course, back in the 1950s and 60s, the United States still thought of itself as a European heritage country. There were some exceptions. For reasons that I still don't fully understand, we had a steeple of excellence in Buddhist studies. I think that had to do with one particularly entrepreneurial faculty member. But in general, there was a strong concentration in European studies. Now, I came from the University of Chicago, where I spent 24 years. And the University of Chicago was founded at about the same time as Stanford, but had a very different trajectory. It started out as a world-class university with deep traditions and also library resources in area studies. For example, in South Asian studies, we had a Department of South Asian, we had a committee on South Asian studies, and we had a center on South Asian studies. And I confess I never did understand exactly what the division of labor was among those three units. So when I arrived at Stanford, it came as some surprise to me that we not only didn't have a Department of South Asian Studies and weren't teaching South Asian languages, but also we had only a few faculty and a very weak center. The budget for South Asian Studies Center in the year that I arrived was $10,000. That was the total university commitment, and they didn't even spend all of that. We had no professor of Arabic literature. We had 38 faculty members in European literatures and 10 for all of Asia. Well, it didn't take much insight to see that Stanford couldn't be a world-class university in the 21st century without coverage of major societies and cultures that were increasingly affecting the United States. If Stanford was going to pretend to educate leaders, it was critical that future leaders know something about the world beyond our boundaries. So what did Stanford have at that point in 2007? Well, it had some foreign language departments, but all of them, except for one, were European. It had area studies centers under the umbrella of International and Comparative Area Studies, ICA, with 14 heterogeneous units. So there were the traditional area studies, Latin America, Europe, Africa, East Asia, and so on. But then there were also other centers like Buddhist studies, Jewish studies, Islamic studies, Asian religions and cultures, and it also housed the international relations undergraduate major. So it seemed to me as I came to know Stanford better that there were some challenges, some of which resembled the challenges that I'd had at Chicago, and some of them peculiar to Stanford. So let me tick them off, and I'll be very interested in our conversation when I'm finished about the ways in which these challenges may resemble the challenges that you face, or they may be quite different. So the first challenge was just simply faculty building. I start as dean and provost with the presumption that strength has to be built on the quality of the faculty. So part of this was a matter of sheer size. We just needed more appointments in more areas. But then there was also the challenge of trying to get an optimal disciplinary distribution in the context where departments at Stanford have to originate faculty appointments. Deans can't do that. And the fact was that the departments didn't necessarily have the same priorities as I did. Now, this was a challenge that looked something like the challenge I'd had at Chicago, where social science departments like political science and economics were more involved in generic theory than in area studies that required language and other specialist knowledge, regional knowledge. The second challenge was transcending the silo inclinations of area centers built around language expertise. This was very powerful at Chicago, and it was powerful here too at Stanford. At Chicago, our South Asia department thought that it couldn't do its job without an appointment in medieval Tamil poetry. That was something that I think Stanford didn't even dream of at the time. The third challenge was the curse of a wealthy university. And this one was peculiar to Stanford. Chicago didn't have such a problem here. And by the curse, I mean that there were too many overlapping centers that were set up in an effort to appeal to donors and to name centers after them. Fourth, there was the challenge of how to manage foreign language teaching. This is, in my view, essential for international studies, but it's hard to do effectively at a research university. The fifth challenge was defining the role of the umbrella ICA, International and Comparative Area Studies. And then finally, we needed to figure out how to define the mission of that area studies program in a distinctive way that would attract faculty and students. This is especially challenging at Stanford with its reputation for being a tech university where foreign languages and international exposure are not particularly valued in and of themselves. So let me tell you a little bit about how we tried to meet those challenges, and I'll do that in reverse order. As far as mission went, the first step was to dump the umbrella label International and Comparative Area Studies, in part because the acronym ICA, nobody could remember what it stood for. It was a terrible brand name. And for that, we substituted the more intelligible Stanford Global Studies. That's intuitively obvious to anybody who listens. I then set up a faculty committee to advise on how ambitious this new umbrella unit, or newly named umbrella unit, should be. And there was a spectrum of possibilities running from a kind of minimal mission of just providing some administrative efficiencies for what were, in some cases, small units, things like student services, to a more expansive goal of programming around common issues, more presence in our undergraduate programs, better space, funding for postdocs, and visiting faculty members. The committee opted for the more expansive version, but in fact, convincing the different units about the common interests that they had turned out to be a continuing uphill climb. In addition, we needed to define a distinctive mission for Stanford Global Studies within the campus, and that's because around campus there are other units that work on global issues. We have the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. We have the Bing Overseas program with 10 campuses around the world where we send our undergraduates. The medical school has a global health program. The Graduate School of Business has a program in development economics, SEED. It was clear in talking to both students and potential donors that it was critical to articulate what Stanford Global Studies did that was different from these other units. And I formulated this in a negative way. I'm not sure it was the most effective way. But I said, Stanford Global Studies is not a unit that's primarily about policy, but it's about basic research and education, because logically that needs to come prior to decisions about policy. We needed to convince students and supporters that depth of knowledge about other societies and cultures is important for understanding and for effective action, both for individuals who may be going into business that involves global contacts, and also institutions. The students need to graduate with an understanding of language, history, political institutions, contemporary cultures, and religious beliefs. Now, this is not an easy case to make, even though I would have thought that the American experience in the Middle East over the last 18 years would make it obvious that, that the mission back in the early 2000s to establish democracies in the Middle East was based on a terrible ignorance about the history, cultures, religions of that region. So that basic research and education is the core mission of Stanford Global Studies. Other units, and we collaborate with the other units are focused on policy. The second issue, language teaching. Now this is a thorny issue that you may face as well. Stanford, in its deeper past, did a lousy job of teaching foreign languages. And then in the 1990s, the School of Humanities and Sciences established a language center to teach foreign languages through the first 3 years. Elizabeth Bernhardt, the director, massively upgraded the quality of language teaching. She emphasized that this was a professional pursuit. It wasn't something where we could just pull somebody off of the street in Palo Alto who happened to be a native speaker and expect them to do an effective job of teaching the students. But it wasn't so easy because the goals of the Language Center didn't and don't coincide perfectly with the department's and the area center's needs. The Language Center is more interested in conversational proficiency, less interested in reading proficiency for research. And there's a different emphasis on which languages ought to be taught. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a disappointing decline in language enrollments. There was a steep increase up to 10 years ago in the enrollments in Chinese and Arabic. Those have declined substantially over the last 10 years. I find that disappointing. On the other hand, we do have more foreign language minors than ever before, and so I suppose that's encouraging. As dean, as an administrator, I faced the question about how much funding should we provide for courses with enrollments of 1 or 2, and we did teach a lot of those. And my own view was that the money would be better spent sending the student to Middlebury or some comparable institution for the summer rather than paying an instructor to teach 1 or 2 students here on campus. We also asked ourselves how we could interest more students in foreign languages. Now, Stanford students are doers more than contemplators, and that's partly about job orientation, but not only. And so what we've done over the last 5 years is put an emphasis on expanding our internship program so that students can be immersed in a foreign culture and language and do that as part of job training. So we've substantially increased our overseas internships from 38 5 years ago to 116 this year. And with that increase in number has come an increase in geographical scope. It was predominantly centered on China 5 years ago. Now the interns are in 30 countries. One that I'm particularly personally interested in and pleased about is human rights. So we have an active internship program sending our students abroad to participate in human rights programs. And it happens that this appeals to both students and donors, and so there's a happy convergence there. And speaking of donors, that brings me to the curse of the wealthy university. As dean, I came to understand that contrary sometimes to the belief or assumption of my development staff, we didn't need to accept every gift. Sometimes they were not in our interest. And so I thought that it required a clarity about our goals and discipline in seeking resources. One of the things that we did was we eliminated Asian religions and cultures as redundant. We got donor blowback about that, but it subsided and it made sense. I have to confess that when I finished up as dean last fall, I had not managed to solve the challenge of organization around Middle Eastern and/or Islamic studies. In part, that's because they're intellectually messy. That is, they don't have exactly the same focus. Indonesia, not part of the Middle East, has the largest Muslim population in the world. It's also because of donor interest. So we have the Abbasi program in Islamic studies. We have an Iranian studies program. And we have a Jewish studies program, all of which might, to some extent, fall under the rubric of Middle East. I appointed an external committee to advise me on how we might reorganize this to try to avoid the overlap. And in the end, that is whether we should have a center on Middle Eastern studies or a center on Islamic studies. The advisory committee came back with the answer, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, which didn't help me at all. And partly the reason that I wasn't able to resolve it is that there are very different interests here of both heritage students and of donors. The Iranian studies program is pretty resolutely secular, whereas the Abbasi program in Islamic studies is, of course, based on religion. As for the challenge of transcending silos, we've had limited success, but I would say only limited, and Kate actually would know more about this than I, because she's in the middle of it right now. We have had some successful programs that cut across the area centers. I mentioned one on Southern Hemisphere cities, megacities. But it isn't easy, and I come to think that much depends on the personalities and propensities of the faculty involved. That is, do the faculty themselves want to move beyond their own regional center, or are they really tightly focused? And the dean can't necessarily determine that. Finally then, faculty building. It was clear to me as dean that I could gain some leverage over department priorities only if I could offer non-fungible incremental faculty positions. And at Stanford, the way to do that is to raise new endowed chairs that are focused on either international studies or particular areas. And so we raised 7 new endowed chairs. Some were attached to specific regions like South Asia or the Middle East. Some were more generally in the area of international studies on the grounds that a generation out, it's hard to know what the dean will most need to cover the regions of the world. But they were all circumscribed in a way that the departments could not use them as fungible appointments and divert them to history of the United States in 1860. In the gift agreements, we built in language to allow assistant professor appointments, and this turned out to be essential for a couple of reasons. First of all, some of these areas, like South Asian studies, are still not as well populated with faculty applicants as American studies, for example. And so being able to move beyond senior appointments and go to younger scholars turned out to be critical in our searches. The second point is, in my experience, younger faculty are more flexible in their thinking and more ready to cross traditional boundaries. And I say that as somebody who wouldn't fall into the category of younger faculty. So we've made appointments, we've filled those chairs. Political science has been a notable success with appointments in South Asia and East Europe. We still have many gaps, but I think we're in a much stronger position than we were 11 years ago. So let me end with a few closing thoughts and then invite comments, questions, any of your thoughts. First, we probably need to accept the fact that a broader idea of global engagement as part of undergraduate education will be necessary. And by that I mean less emphasis on fluency in foreign languages and specialization in majors. Our overseas program used to require some coursework in the language before being accepted into a program abroad. So they had to take some German before going to Berlin, some Italian before going to Florence, some Chinese before going to Beijing. Unfortunately, we've had to drop that requirement because otherwise we simply would have had to close programs for lack of enrollment. Now, this ran into fierce faculty resistance, and I myself feel some reservations because I'm acutely aware of the importance of language. But the pragmatic choice was between a diluted international engagement or none at all. And there have been some offsetting changes for the better. When our Florence Center was opened more than 50 years ago, the students stayed together in a fancy villa up the hill at Fiesole. And as I've talked to alumni who went to Florence in that era, They were very successful at finding future spouses. They were very successful at drinking and partying, but it's not clear how much they engaged with the local culture. Now, the students who go over are in homestays, and they have to engage with real Italians. More broadly, our director of Stanford Global Studies, Jeremy Weinstein, has been very energetically working on how to develop curricular ideas that will give all undergraduates a meaningful international engagement based on their own interests. And of course, this is particularly a challenge in areas like computer science, which is the exploding major at Stanford as it is on some other campuses. Second thought, Stanford, as you may or may not know, is a very secular university in the shadow of Silicon Valley, where the mantra is problem solving through technology. When we discuss diversity requirements in the curriculum, our well-meaning faculty automatically think race, class, and gender. Some years ago, sitting on a faculty committee, I heard a colleague who is of Pakistani heritage challenge that presumption by saying, in the part of the world his family came from, that trio doesn't address the most salient aspect of diversity, and that is religion. Trying to understand the world today without a deeper knowledge of world religions strikes me as a really serious blind spot. And yet Stanford has a very small department of religious studies, and religion is not, frankly, on the radar of most undergraduates. One of our most popular religious studies courses is titled Stanford as a Religion. So I think, our first job is to understand what interests our students as they come to college, but then not simply to cater to those interests. We need to try to figure out how to shape them, and that won't be easy because I think they come with the belief that Silicon Valley is the center of the world. So have we made any progress to rise above the Eurocentrism? Well, I think there's been some progress, but my worry is that the world may be changing faster than we're adapting. And finally, I would say, this has not only consequences for our students understanding the world beyond our borders, but it's become obvious in the last couple of years that it has very serious domestic consequences as we try to rise above our own xenophobia. So thank you, and I'd be glad to take questions.
Let me grab a microphone.
Okay. So I gather we're taping this and they want to make sure that you're heard. I see a hand over here.
My name is Mary Kaiser, and I'm at Foothill College, political science, and I was an undergrad at Stanford many decades ago. So I'm curious why only France of the overseas studies centers is represented, if you can answer that. And I'd particularly be interested with Germany. It seems like they should definitely be.
So this goes to the point about, so there are two forces that play into this list. One of them I mentioned, and that is donor interest. And in the case of France, we had a donor who was interested in a France center. This happened before I was dean, and Asian religions and cultures was something that I could cut because it didn't have an endowment. But where a center has an endowment, it's much harder to change. But it also had a really powerful faculty interest, and so that has sustained. It's not what I would call a hollow center. That is a center that isn't based on faculty research interest and teaching. So that's why, but you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that this is not a rational list. If somebody were starting from a blank piece of paper, the one victory that I did have was it turned out that we actually had 2 Europe centers in addition to the France Center. One housed in International Comparative Area Studies and the other housed in the Friedman Spogli Institute for International Studies. And early on, I got a complaining email from Norman Neymark, professor in history, who said, those 2 centers have scheduled important lectures at identical times on the same day. And so that caught my attention and called attention to the fact that we needed only one. And so we actually combined those 2 to what now is the Europe Center, wherever that is, the Europe Center. You know, any changes have to take account of the different constituencies involved.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Roach from College of San Mateo. And early in your talk, you mentioned at Chicago that they had library resources in many area studies. I was wondering if once you came to Stanford, if you had partnered with libraries to build library collections in different areas, or if that was one of the challenges that you had faced here and how that was met.
That's a very good question, and I think the answer is yes, to a certain extent. So in the faculty report that I mentioned earlier in the talk, in thinking about how to do things at Stanford, we decided that there were 2 broad principles that we probably needed to follow. One was that we were not going to go to a departmental organization for this because really the strength of Stanford is collaboration across departments, and we should take advantage of that. And in any case, setting up a brand new department it requires a 9-figure endowment. I mean, it's just hugely expensive. But then we also decided that we probably needed to concentrate on modern interests, research interests, student interests, because with those interests you can depend much more on internet resources, journal resources. You don't need deep manuscript resources or museum resources at the University of Chicago. If you go to Chicago, one of the sites that's most often neglected by visitors is the Oriental Institute on the Chicago campus, which has a marvelous ancient Middle East collection. Stanford was never going to have that. So we thought that in general we would make things more contemporary and more internet resource based. Having said that, there still has been an issue. The library director, Mike Keller, he complained about the fact that we were making more appointments in South Asian studies and that the faculty were making requests for resources that the library didn't already have. So we didn't completely solve the problem. I will say that the relationship with the library has been interesting and complicated. One of the things that I hope will be a legacy of my time, although it's still in formation, is an internet library for Southeast Asian resources. And with the right kind of gift, and we may be able to secure it, the idea would be to make Stanford the center for Southeast Asian studies. And since so many of the countries in Southeast Asia don't have major library resources, and since our library really specializes in internet distribution, there's a real opportunity there. And as I say, I hope it'll come to fruition because obviously Southeast Asia is such an important emerging region from the U.S. point of view. Okay.
Good morning. I'm Lizette Gould from CSU Spain. My interest is in the Middle East. As a journalist for the AP, that's where I was. So I'm quite interested in your view of partnerships between Stanford and the American universities in the Middle East, like Beirut and CSU. AUC, for example, American University in Cairo, and American University in Doha.
I think Stanford's general principle, and it's one that I subscribe to, is that that's driven by faculty interests. So if a faculty member comes to me and says, this is important for our students and our research, I would be glad to try to figure out how to support it. On the other hand, partnerships that don't have a basis in faculty interests generally are empty. I mean, over the years as dean, I have had people approach me. There was one case in particular from Mexico, I've forgotten what institution there, came to me and said, we have this 20-year-old agreement with the University of Chicago, and what are you going to do about it? And the answer was, nobody had known about it at Chicago for at least 15 years. I mean, it was buried in a file drawer. So it needs to be based on faculty activity. That's also true for the overseas studies programs. We take the view, and I think this is right, that we don't want overseas studies programs that are completely outsourced. I mean, we do allow students to take courses for credit at other universities around the world, and I think that's important because that's true immersion. But we have trouble figuring out how to set up campuses in countries where we don't have deep faculty interest, and we're still very thin on Africa, most of Asia, and we have a long way to go before we can manage that.
Thank you.
Let's see, microphone is coming. Either way.
Hi, I'm Gustavo Demon, Business Division at the West Los Angeles College. Most of the areas that you mentioned are very hot spots for startups today. And I was thinking about, what do you think about leveraging the growth for the global studies programs using the reach and needs of the computer science and business schools here at Stanford?
So I think that makes a lot of sense. I have to say that my own experience doesn't make me optimistic about that. I have a student who just graduated, a Ghanaian-born student who came from the south side of Chicago, just graduated, and she's going to go over to Nigeria to participate in a startup that's providing internet services for African companies. I think that's terrific, but I'm not sure she would be doing it if she weren't Ghanaian by birth. And I have tried to talk to business school deans over the years to try to draw them in more, and really, I would have to say, without success, even though they tell very funny stories about their naive students going over to, say, Ghana, where the business school has a center in Accra, and talking to Ghanaians in the startup world about how to do it, and having such a culture gap that the two sides couldn't understand what the others were saying. So to me, it's obvious it may simply be, a problem of scarcity of time, that they don't feel like this is important enough. We do provide some services. So for example, in Chinese language teaching in the Language Center, there is a track for business. And so I think we're trying to help in that way. And I actually don't know, Jeremy Weinstein was talking to engineering school faculty about this, and I'm not sure what has resulted from that, because my term as dean ended on September 1st, and I've been trying to forget about it ever since.
Thank you, Professor Saller, for your nice opening remarks. That actually, I'm sorry, I'm just the keynote speech, right? I wonder whether the language and culture actually impacts the way we think and the way we teach and learn. I'm only partly teaching mathematics at Fuller College, so I wonder if your study, that global studies, include the impact of the culture and the language on even math education, the difference in math education between cultures.
I think, well, I'm aware of that, partly because my wife is an anthropologist who's doing a comparative round-the-globe study on how people think about thinking. Having said that, I don't know that that's the focus for our programs. Where's Kate? Kate, does Stanford Global Studies have programs based on cultural differences in education and learning?
Not in education. We partner sometimes with the School of Education, but not on specific programs focusing on that.
Okay, so I think the answer to that is probably not. And, this is probably another aspect of ethnocentrism. I sit on the University Grants Committee in Hong Kong, the committee that distributes all of the public funding to the 8 public universities there. And so I'm a bit aware of the very different mindset that they go in with. And I think, one of the things that's going to happen is Americans are going to have to become more aware of the fact that, for example, Shanghai students now are graduating at a higher level of proficiency than American students in that, or Singapore, and that ought to be causing us to reflect on our own teaching methods and assumptions. But I don't know I think that has not gone very deep in the culture yet, so can't give you an optimistic answer.
I appreciated a remark you made. You said that Stanford students are doers, not contemplators. Maybe that's the problem. And maybe the admissions office needs to address that when they review applicants for Stanford and for other schools. Because what I'm seeing more and more as a history instructor at Diablo Valley College is the instrumentalism of the academy. And that's a serious issue. And I sometimes feel like I'm antediluvian, but I'm still holding on to this idea that deep thinking is what education should be about, contemplation.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that was probably the most important cause that I tried to champion for the last 5 or 6 years that I was dean here. And we did work with the admissions office, and in fact they did change the mix of the incoming class. I talked to the dean of admission just last week, who said that he thought one of my legacies would be a stronger emphasis on humanities in admissions. Having said that, they're fighting a very steep uphill battle. And in trying to, as you know, Stanford has this really tough reputational challenge. The London Times Higher Education rankings rated Stanford Humanities and Arts #1 in the world for 7 years running. And yet, last year when they issued the rankings, the article led with, "It's a surprise that Stanford, a tech university, leads the world in humanities and arts." And I thought, why is it a surprise after 7 years? I mean, this shows just how tough the reputational problem is. We've thought within the school about how to work on the reputation, but this is really a university issue, and I'm waiting to see what the president and provost are going to do about it. I think it's true that Stanford, of all universities, needs to be taking the lead in trying to resist the kind of crude instrumentalism that you're talking about. Having said that, we did do a fairly small-scale survey with an external contractor about how family thinking has changed about education. And it won't come as any surprise to you to hear that families now, at a very high rate, say that their principal concern is that their children will not enjoy the same standard of living that they've enjoyed. So that's the starting point. And what's maybe even more surprising about that is that that was true both for parents who came from Ivy League level institutions and for families that were first generation. In other words, families that were living examples of being successful in the old, less instrumental version of education still subscribed to the view that their children needed to come out of college with careers. And this is a complicated issue because Stanford has made, contrary to what you would think from the news media, Stanford has made very considerable efforts to recruit more first-generation students. With that, we have to accept the fact that those students feel an obligation to their families, to themselves, to pay back from the day after graduation. And when Silicon Valley is offering $100,000 signing bonuses to computer science graduates, it would be irresponsible of me to say to those students, you shouldn't pay attention to family needs. So, part of this is the changing American culture. Part of it is the changing campus demography. And so that's partly why I think we do need to figure out how to incorporate international studies, history, religion, language, into the interests that they come with. And as a graduate of a monastic college in Cambridge, I appreciate the monastic culture, and I think there's some advantages to it, but that's not where we are right now. And if we're going to be effective, we need to accept that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Julie Kasperson-Schultz from Sierra College. And you mentioned something about you realized the need to focus on human rights internationally. So I was wondering what has been done or what is planned that you're planning to do.
So we have a human rights center, and just last year it started a human rights minor, and there's been substantial interest in that. It draws faculty from around the campus. It offers an array of courses and then speakers, and the students go off to do all kinds of things. They are monitors for the Khmer Rouge trials in Cambodia. They work in Indonesia. I don't remember all of the different areas where the interns go off to. Some of these do studies in the United States. So I actually co-taught a course. I myself am a Roman historian. I co-taught a course last quarter with an old friend and colleague who works now heavily in the area of human rights, a senior advisor in the Khmer Rouge trials, involved in other aspects of the International Criminal Court. And we taught a course on human rights, ancient and modern, and tried to get the students to understand the historical roots of notions of human rights and to understand that, Rome, which is sometimes celebrated for its grandeur, was based on the most brutal kind of slave labor. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do, but it's very much in formation right now. And I think it's not quite clear what direction it will take. When I was dean, I always tried to think about endowment gifts in terms of whether the subject matter was something that was going to be of interest a generation or two down the road, or whether it was, a problem of the moment. Human rights, I think, is an issue that's going to be with us for a very long time, even though I think we have made progress. And so I was happy to look for endowment. We endowed, one of the 7 endowed chairs that I mentioned is in the area of human rights and international justice. So the students are interested, and we're doing our best to figure out how to serve that interest and stimulate that interest.
Hi, my name is Tina Mosley. I'm from Learning College and I teach economics. I'm interested to know about if you have this program on behavior economics in global perspective.
Not that I'm aware of, and I think that's a very important point. I mentioned our naive business school students, and this was an account by their own dean, so it's not that but I think that account of the culture gap shows that though our students are taught behavioral economics in an abstract way, a lot of it is based on the United States, whether you or I put more money into our retirement account or not. I don't think it's based in deep cultural differences that I think they could use, more. As I said, my wife is an anthropologist, and one of the places that she's worked has been Accra in Ghana, and she's interested in evangelical Christianity around the world. And she has a tape or a film of a mass megachurch in Accra, where the minister is preaching an evangelical message of success, and he's effectively selling vials of oil that will guarantee success. And I wonder whether our business students are fully aware of that kind of practice as a part of the business world that they think they're entering into. I doubt it.
Good morning. My name is Narendra Bansal. I'm from Maloney College. I teach environmental studies, global studies, and geography. So, Master of None, by the way, just for the record. I'm currently incorporating more of the global studies into environmental studies. I know I'm doing something with some other folks here on campus. How do you incorporate the global with the environmental? Because I notice my students either go into global studies or they go to environmental studies.
So that is another very good question. There is some collaboration and interface. I don't know whether it's as full as it might be, but it is certainly true that environmental issues are one of the primary reasons why we need to think about the globe, not just our own country. I think a lot of things grow out of emerging faculty interests. So some of the appointments that have been made recently in the social sciences, political science, for example, have been about how environmental issues interact with politics in South Asia. And I would certainly encourage that. I think we could be doing much more. And there are a lot of things going on around campus that are not based in Stanford Global Studies. For example, Gretchen Daly's natural capital project, working heavily in China, for example. I don't think she is heavily involved in SGS, but there are things going on. I think it is primarily out of Earth and out of the Woods Institute for Environmental Studies. I think that's where most of the activity is right now. Anything else? Yes.
I'm Scott Langford from Foothill College. I'm going to ask this. I wanted to ask you about the internal transformation within fields, including within your own field. So as a classic scholar, as a scholar of the Roman Empire, I'm aware, vaguely as an outsider, that there's been a deep transformation including the impact of climate change on the Roman Empire as a decisive factor, including reversing the idea that all roads lead to Rome, and more the idea that Rome was borrowing heavily and aggressively and successfully, and not from other cultures. So I think that there is a piece of this that's like, how do we borrow from the strengths from within? The second question, related, however, is we're also undergoing deep, steep declines in foreign language enrollment in community colleges. Hard to know how to reverse it, but at the same time, we have so many more students on campus who have language abilities, cultural knowledge, and cultural capital that we can leverage. So just as you're right about your first-gen students, now Stanford does more in that area. So in other words, so how do we leverage what we already have to really focus on global, economic, environmental, cultural issues?
Yeah, good. So, first of all, you're exactly right. I have to confess that I'm coming back to Roman history after 24 years in full-time administration. So I'm trying to catch up, and there's been a lot more done than I had recognized. And one of the differences is exactly the one you identified, and that is Roman history, ancient history in general, is much more heavily science-based now than it was 24 years ago. Environmental change, ancient DNA, modern DNA, bone analysis, and I could go on. And with that has gone a transformation in the way that the studies are done. So now they are team efforts, and this is generally the case for the direction of social sciences, I think. Much more of it is team-based rather than individual faculty effort. Having said all of that, I've come to think from my first pass at reading that that there are different levels of generality. And so, for example, the Roman Empire is really a patchwork of hundreds of different cultures, towns, environments. And so with environmental studies, archaeologists can show us that there may be changes in irrigation patterns or something in one area. That's very different from saying that the whole Roman Empire experienced this. And in fact, the whole point about microclimates is that it makes it very hard to generalize. So, you know, when we talk about who was emperor when, I can generalize for the whole empire with the exception of a few years when there were multiple contestants to the throne. But for something like environment and its impact on agriculture, we have not yet reached the point where we can make generalizations that cover the empire. I think the science wave is still emerging, and I'm not sure where it's going to carry us. As far as the point about capitalizing on our students' background, you know, I think that's right. Just in the very first instance, forcing us to think in different terms. At the University of Chicago, I taught for 20 years in the famous Western Civ course there. And it was regarded as a painful and radical change to change the title of that to European Civ as a more accurate title and less kind of sweeping and all-encompassing. And that was in part a recognition that our student heritage was not the same as it was in the 1950s, 1960s. You know, Stanford now is majority-minority, actually by quite a bit. The issue that I think about when this comes up is that sometimes our heritage students and our alumni don't have the same interests that I do as a scholar. And, you know, maybe part of that is a cultural difference, but I think universities have a certain kind of mission about research and dissemination of knowledge, and sometimes that's a nice overlap with heritage students, heritage alumni. Sometimes it's not, and so navigating that, I think, isn't always simple. And we had a few issues, none of them huge, but we had a few issues that came up in my time as dean where there was a kind of conflict. Okay, well, thank you very much.